Hello, my name is Melissa Niles. I am the Urban Ag Liaison for South Dakota Specialty Produce Association. I would like to thank Dr. Amanda Bachmann with joining us today to teach us about gardening friends and foes. This webinar has been funded under the Conservation Collaboration Agreement between the NRCS and the South Dakota Specialty Produce Association to produce sustainable agriculture practices and environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of the USDA or NRCS. Welcome, Dr. Bachmann.
Hi, thanks for having me. So for housekeeping, if folks have questions, just throw those in the Q&A box, and I will go over those at the end of my presentation. But I'm going to go ahead and share my slideshow here. So it looks like that should look good. And yeah, we're going to talk about some garden friends and foes today. And I'm based in Pierre, South Dakota. I'm the SDSU Extension Urban Entomology Field Specialist, and some of you might also know me as one of our South Dakota SARE state co-coordinators. So I help cover that program as well. So if you've got questions about that, that's another thing you can get in touch with me about. But today we're going to talk about the insect side of my job. There we go. So yeah, we're going to talk about what insects and some of their allies do for the environment. This is kind of a framework that I like to use around insects and critters in the garden because there's a lot of stuff that we sort of share the environment with. And a lot of people can have kind of a knee-jerk reaction of they see an insect somewhere and they're like, oh, it must be doing something bad or wrong or not be helping me. And I just want to kind of broaden everybody's horizons and go over some of the different ecosystem services that insects and other arthropods provide in the garden. Each one of these bullet points could probably be its own hour presentation, but we're going to hit some highlights in each one, talk about some strategies for insect identification and some resources that are out there. I've also included a few critters that I want people to be on the lookout going into, the 2025 growing season, because there's always something new, especially insect-wise, that sort of is moving across the country. But we're going to talk about decomposers and pollinators, obviously, and then also biomass movers, which is where I lump our herbivores, things that are eating plant material. But biomass movers can also be predators, and we've got some natural enemies to talk about as well. So we're going to start out with our decomposers, and these are the things that are breaking down plant or animal or other biological material into the soil. These are the things that you might notice them in your compost pile, or if you've got a lot of, a nice layer of leaf litter, these are some critters that you might find there. And sometimes these decomposers can kind of ride the line depending on where you're finding them. Some of them have the potential to be, a little bit pesty, but for the most part, there's something that there are ways to mitigate them without utilizing or needing to utilize any sort of chemical control. So we're going to, be discussing all of these with sort of an integrated pest management or an IPM framework. I did pesticide education in sort of my previous life with SDSU Extension, so I've probably talked to many of you about pesticide safety, and they're absolutely a tool in the toolbox, but I want to make sure that folks are understanding why insects are important, and then what are some ways that you can sort of make sure that you're not just doing a knee-jerk, spray first, ask questions later reaction. So getting back to our decomposers, I'm starting with earwigs because these are one that I probably hear the most about during the growing season, especially if we have areas of South Dakota that are getting a lot of moisture during the summer. Earwigs are always a hot topic. They kind of look terrifying. Most people do not find them pretty or cute at all. They've got those two cerci or pinchers coming out of the end of their abdomen. They have, you can see the abdomen. They've got little tiny wing pads. Their wings are really folded up under there. And you'll find them usually like underneath pots, inside the whorls of milkweed leaves, as pictured here, sometimes under your hostas, and people just do not like to see these. They are really interesting in that as insects, they exhibit parental care. So the earwig moms will actually take care of the nymphs, which I find really interesting. But these guys are a very common decomposer in the gardens. They'll usually be feeding on decaying plant material, but in high numbers, they can end up feeding on live plant material. And so that's when people kind of get annoyed by them. But really, managing moisture is the way to manage earwigs. So if you've got potted plants, um, you can lift those up so that you've got air circulation underneath. If you're seeing a lot of these in the garden, in a certain spot, maybe you've got some irrigation that's leaking. I know I've got some, soil surface drip irrigation in my garden that I put out every year. And the areas where the hose is a little bit more permeable than others, like, that's where I'll see, more earwigs or even, maybe some more slugs, which are definitely not my favorite. But yeah, earwigs, they look terrifying, but really they're mostly harmless and they do serve a purpose out there in the garden. Ants actually also fall under the decomposer umbrella. Ants are also biomass movers. They will move seeds around in the soil. They'll eat almost anything. They're very omnivorous. But this is a picture of a fallen dragonfly, and the ants were taking it apart to take all the juicy bits back to their nest. Ants are another one that, like, they are out there. They are a social insect. You are never going to win against ants. So I do encourage folks to get cool with them. Um, Sometimes if you disturb their colony, you just end up creating a greater problem because then they'll spread more. So if you can be cool with the ants, they do they do some helpful things out there, including taking apart some dead insects, and also moving consuming weed seeds and moving things around in the soil profile. Um, if you're finding them in your house, that's a whole other presentation. But ants outside, that's where they're supposed to be. So I encourage folks to let them live. And just maybe take some care that you're not stepping on an ant nest, because then they can get a little bit bitey. But good news, we don't have fire ants in South Dakota to worry about. So we'll move on to a little bit of some palate cleanser insects. We have our pollinators, and we've got lots of different pollinators in South Dakota. Obviously, honeybees are a very big industry in the state. Not going to cover those here. I actually don't think I have any pictures of honeybees in this presentation. I've got a lot of bumblebees. But yeah, if you've got a backyard beehive, you probably know many things about the honeybees. But the other pollinators that we have, a lot of them are bees. We do have some flies, obviously our butterflies, but bumblebees are really cool. Those are our social native bee species. So if you're lucky enough to have a bumblebee colony in your yard, like that's always super cool. And you can see this bumblebee here on a cup plant on the left part of the slide, just covered in pollen. So they do a great job of just hopping in flowers and moving pollen around, starting from very early in the spring, like as soon as you've got dandelions blooming, some of our early blooming flowering trees and shrubs. Those are really helpful for the bumblebee queens that are out and about, trying to get their colony started for the year. So yeah, bumblebees. There's the Bumblebee Atlas if you want to get into learning how to identify the about 20 species that we have in South Dakota. And then on the right here, we've got our squash bees. So those are in a squash flower. So if you're somebody who's growing zucchini, pumpkins, butternuts, any of those big winter squashes, you may have noticed squash bees hanging around. And those are specialist pollinators. These are a solitary species, but they will hang out together in the flowers. But they only like those cucurbit flowers. So it's a really specific relationship, um, and they're very efficient pollinators of those plants. So we've got some pollinators out there that will go to anything that's flowering, and then we've got some that are sort of much more picky in what they'll utilize as a resource. Even more, it's hard to resist pictures of bees and flowers. On the very left there, you can see I let some basil go to flower this summer, and there's a tiny green metallic bee on there. You can see the stripy abdomen and the green thorax, and that's another one that you might notice and not actually realize that it's a bee. So not all of our bees are black and yellow and fuzzy. Some of them are small and green and metallic, but there's quite a diversity of pollinators out there, and obviously including our monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies, I just saw sort of the news release that there might be a decision about listing them under the Endangered Species Act coming in the next couple of months. So that's going to be really impactful if that happens, as far as how we talk about habitat creation and management. So that's definitely something that I'm keeping an eye on. But these are some of our most charismatic of the mini fauna. They have a fascinating life history where they overwinter in Mexico. Generations move north every spring and summer. And then by the time they get up here to South Dakota, we maybe have a couple of, maybe one, maybe two generations of, egg laying and reproduction. And then the butterflies that emerge in, August and September, those are the ones that are heading back down to Mexico. They've never been there before, but they somehow, hopefully, managed to make it. And they're a reason why we want to encourage folks to have floral resources, things blooming all the way up until frost. So as you're gardening and thinking about maybe how you can balance some of these, dealing with some pest issues with also providing habitat for beneficials, think about what you have that's going to be blooming into September or October, depending on when your sort of normal first frost date is. I know here in Pierre this past fall, we didn't have a hard freeze until November, which was absolutely wild. And I had some annuals in pots that were, blooming throughout, but the insect activity on them really dropped off about the second week in October. So yeah, just my cute little monarch butterfly caterpillar picture there on some milkweed. That was actually in a road ditch in South Dakota. It wasn't in anyone's yard. It was very exciting to find one milkweed sort of out in the wild, and then also have a caterpillar on it. So that was really cool. But yeah, anything that we can do to help sort of conserve these critters, it helps provide habitat not only for the monarch butterflies, but also for some of those other pollinators that I mentioned earlier. And then habitat too for some of the natural enemies that we'll talk about a little bit later. And if you're somebody who, as you're gardening, has maybe been getting some pushback about how you're keeping your space, just know that there are some really nice educational pollinator habitat signs out there that you can purchase from some of the different nonprofits and organizations that do pollinator and just general habitat conservation work. So these are a few that I've utilized in the past. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's definitely a great place to start. So if you're working on a habitat project, there are definitely resources out there to help with the educational signage. You don't have to feel like you always have to start that from scratch. But yeah, let's put pollinator conservation back on our 2025 New Year's resolution list. Moving into some different biomass movers. So these are things that are going to be moving energy through the food chain. We're going to start with our predators. So these are critters that are going to be perhaps eating other insects, which can be helpful in a garden situation. And on this slide, we've got the green lacewing as both an adult and as its nymph. So the adult is pictured here on the left. You can see it has a bright green body, really like lacy membranous wings. If you've ever, turned on your back porch light at night in the summer, you've probably seen these flying towards the light. They're very common. I can guarantee you've got them in your garden. What you might not have noticed before are the nymphs of the green lacewings. And you can see on the right there, I have one on my watch band. I don't recommend doing this because they do have pointy mouth parts that they will stab into their prey. Usually an aphid. They're really great at eating aphids. So they'll stab the aphid and then digest it with their saliva and like suck out the juices. So it's a very cool like thing to watch. I've definitely, moved a lacewing larva to a plant that had aphids before just to see what happens. It's really, really quite fantastic. But in this case, this one actually did stab my skin. And turns out I've got a really bad reaction to lacewing saliva, and I had a heck of a bite on my wrist that did not look pretty. So don't handle them, but just know that they kind of remind me a little bit of ladybug larvae. They have that sort of same like alligator-y appearance, but they're also out there, stabbing aphids and sucking them dry. So they're some good predators to have out there in the garden. Another example of a predator is an ambush bug. This was out in the field. I was like, oh, this is such a cool little skipper. And it's, being so good for getting its picture taken. And then I realized that there was an ambush bug that had caught the skipper in the flower and was in the process of consuming it. So these guys are a little bit bigger. I usually see them in sunflower heads in my yard, but they're another sort of generalist predator. They've got raptorial or like, chunky forelegs that they use to catch their prey. And then they stab it with their piercing sucking mouth part and suck out the insides. So these predators, they're not going to ever get you down to a zero pest population, but they are out there, doing their part to, chow down on a few things that, might be a problem in the garden. Obviously, this skipper, not a problem, but it was just a very cool thing to see out in nature. Some other natural enemies to keep an eye out for are parasitoid wasps. So you can see on the left, there's like a small brown, oops, let me go back there. I accidentally clicked. A small brown sort of circle, and that is an aphid that was parasitized by a very small wasp. So you might not ever see the wasps, but you're probably going to see the evidence of them. And so what the wasp does is it lays an egg inside the aphid. That egg hatches, it consumes the aphid from the inside, and then sort of turns the aphid into its pupal chamber. So an actual, a small adult wasp will emerge from that little brown sort of aphid mummy or aphid sac. They aren't going to eliminate all the aphids, but they can help kind of keep them at a lower level. So if you see those mummies, you've got parasitoid wasps, which means that you've got the predators and the prey sort of in the same area. And then on the right, we have a ladybug pupa. So it's always cool to go to the greenhouse and kind of scout around. And sometimes you're like, oh, hey, I'm going to buy this pepper plant because it comes with some free biocontrol. But ladybugs are great at eating aphids and other small soft-bodied critters as both larvae and adults. So if you notice, any of these pupa on your plants or out in your garden, let them hang out because those are going to be ladybug adults soon. And so those pupa, sometimes I think people might not either notice them or know what they are, because usually they're on like the underside of a leaf or maybe a little bit hidden, but they're going to turn into something good for your garden. So one thing too with a lot of these predators, especially the smaller ones, is that insecticide applications are generally going to be non-selective. So they're going to kill, both the aphid or the pest and also any predators that might be around. So, as you're scouting your garden to see what's happening, make sure that you're taking note of not just the pest insects that you might be seeing, but also keep note of what beneficials you're noticing out there as well. Things like aphids can rebound a lot faster after an insecticide application than, say, a population of ladybugs. Predators, I've been an advocate for wasps. They are, I do enjoy this meme. They're gonna be just as valuable as bees if we give them a chance. And like, did a wasp write this? But wasps are not only are they pollinators, but they are also predators. They will actually hunt soft-bodied critters and use those to take back and feed to their larvae. So I've, spotted wasps carrying off caterpillars. In the case of the cicada killer, which is on the left there, that's a very specific relationship where they will, hunt cicadas. Cicadas aren't something that I consider to be a garden pest, but they are abundant in South Dakota, and thus the cicada killer wasps are as well. And so I do get a lot of questions about those. So just trying to get more people to know that cicada killers are cool, and you don't need to try to control them. They're just out for the cicadas. But some of our European paper wasps that are introduced species and social, if you're noticing their nest early in the season and it's somewhere that you don't want it to be, that's when you want to be managing that nest and getting rid of it. But by the time you get to about September, that nest is going to be at its maximum size, and your best bet is to wait for a frost. You don't want to be trying to deal with that yourself. You've somehow managed to live with it throughout the whole season. Just let it go for a couple more weeks. But if you see wasps outside in your garden, just know that they are visiting flowers to get nectar for themselves, and they're also going to be hunting through your plants and pulling out some of those things like maybe your cabbage white caterpillars in order to feed to their larvae. And we do have some very cool solitary wasps. This one is the steel blue cricket hunter. I see them every year in my yard, usually one or two. They spend a lot of time running on the ground. They do kind of a flit from place to place. They're not sort of a long distance flyer, but they're an absolutely stunning blue metallic color. And I encourage you that if you see them, to just let them do their thing. They just want to hunt crickets and use them to feed their larvae. They paralyze the cricket, lay an egg on it and shove it in a ground nest. And then their larva, the egg hatches and eats the cricket. So we have a really cool diversity of wasps out there in South Dakota that I feel like don't get the same amount of love as our diversity of, say, bumblebees. We also have the velvet ants, which a lot of people consider to be pretty fearsome. However, anytime I see them, they're always like running away from me as fast as they can. But these are also a solitary wasp. They don't have wings. The females are wingless, and they do have the sort of very dramatic name of being called a cow killer because apparently they do have a painful sting. However, I always see them running in the opposite direction of me, so trying to get a picture of them can be really tricky. But they're another sort of really cool solitary wasp that we have out there in South Dakota. Some people might think that they should be considered a pest because they do predate on ground nesting bees. But I kind of think of it as, if you have a habitat where you're seeing a velvet ant, that means that you've got enough habitat for like enough ground nesting bees to support, one sort of like apex insect predator. So I consider them to be sort of a sign of a healthy garden ecosystem and not something that you would want to be controlling or managing. And also, they just are very pretty. They look really cool. Yes, you should definitely be cool with spiders. I think sometimes, the title of this presentation was Garden Friends and Foes. A lot of people might think of, say, like wasps or something they would put under the foe category, and maybe spiders as well. But hopefully I'll give you some points that, why you should be cool with both of those groups of arthropods. But spiders are fantastic predators. They set up their nice little webs, um, and they hang out in your potted plants. In this case, a little jumping spider, which are very cute. I find them quite adorable. And they're just nice generalist predators. They're going to be hanging out and, catching mosquitoes in their webs, running down other things. I usually have some jumping spiders on my back door that will be catching some of the small flies that land in that location. So that's always really cool to see. But yeah, spiders, totally fine. The only one that we have sort of human medical importance in South Dakota is the black widow. And really, as long as you're, shaking out your gloves, shaking out your boots, it's not something that's out to get people. Spiders think that we're scary, and they generally will be running away from us. When they end up getting in tight corners or crushed by hands or feet, that's when things can get dicey. So make sure you're shaking out your equipment. That's just a good part of some, farm or garden safety right there. So some more biomass movers, but this time talking about ones that are eating plants. I've got aphids on the left there. These are some milkweed aphids on a milkweed plant. Aphids can be very host specific. So like the species of aphid that you're going to see on a milkweed is going to be different than the species that you see maybe on your sweet corn. Um, so you're going to have, but there's lots of predators out there, like we talked about, the ladybugs, the lacewings, syrphid fly larvae, um, our spiders, our wasps. There's lots of stuff out there that's going to be eating aphids. So if you're seeing them, it's important to scout and kind of keep records of, what kind of population trends you're seeing over time. But then also to take note of like, are you seeing any evidence of that predation um, in the populations as well? And like the hot tip for aphid scouting is they do like the growing points of the plant. So that's always a good place to check first as you're looking for maybe any aphids during the season. But they have a really cool life cycle. They reproduce asexually. So during the summer, they'll just be popping out clones of themselves, which is why they can sort of increase their population so quickly after, being hit with an insecticide. Any of the survivors are going to be able to reproduce uh, very fast. They don't have to, wait around to find a mate or anything. Once they reach adulthood, they can just pop out more little aphid clones. And then we've also got grasshoppers on the right there. There's always grasshoppers in South Dakota. I don't think I've had a year without questions about grasshoppers. And they are always going to be easier to control when they're small. So another, sort of hopefully point for scouting and scouting early is that, if you're seeing the grasshoppers when they're small, that's the time to be hitting them with like the insect growth regulator or maybe a perimeter like insecticide spray. Once they get to be full size with their full size wings, they've done a ton of damage by that point. And they're going to be much harder to kill just because they're so much bigger. So they're some of our big biomass movers in just across South Dakota. Caterpillars are also going to be eating plant material, and it kind of depends on what they turn into, sort of how tolerant we are of certain caterpillars. These caterpillars are of the Gorgon checker spot butterfly. So these are feeding on a stiff sunflower leaf. They were out in a pollinator garden, so like we were cool if, the plant was, providing the resource it needed to provide, and the caterpillars were doing what they were supposed to do in order to turn into cute little, native Gorgon checker spot butterflies. But, if these were cabbage white caterpillars, the green guys all over your kale, you might not look quite so favorably on them. But caterpillars are the immature form of our butterflies and moths, and they have to consume a lot of plant material in order to have enough energy to turn into whatever that adult form they're going to take is. So yeah, if you're seeing caterpillars, um, some of them are very host specific. So if you know what plant there are, you can kind of narrow down what they're going to turn into and maybe decide on like, do you want that butterfly later, or is it something that you need to manage because, maybe they are eating all of your Swiss chard? Japanese beetles are that's one of our beetle biomass movers. These are very polyphagous. They are not host specific, really, in any sense of the word. They will eat many things in the garden. They really enjoy roses. You can see here they're on some snap beans. But if you are in the southeastern corner of South Dakota or sort of anywhere moving north along that I-29 corridor, you have probably encountered Japanese beetles, or you might be encountering them soon. Anytime I go to McCrory Gardens, they're always on the roses there, so I know they're in Brookings. We've had sort of pop-ups of seeing them in Pier, but I don't think we have an established population yet. The grubs, the immature form of the Japanese beetle, lives in turf. So if you've got like a turf lawn, and then you've got a garden full of all sorts of different, trees and shrubs and annuals and perennials, like you've got the whole buffet for both parts of the Japanese beetle life cycle, just sort of all in one place. But they're a very distinctive beetle. They're about 3/4 of an inch long. You can see that they've got that nice bronze metallic color on their hind wings, and their bodies are like a green metallic. So they're kind of pretty, but they are not great to have in the garden. There are pheromone traps for them. However, they're so attractive that you might pull in like more Japanese beetles to your yard than like what you had to start with. So we don't usually recommend those for folks. And kind of depending on what management techniques you want to use, they're easier to control as grubs. So the granular treatments in lawns are much more sort of specific to the pest, so you're not going to have as many non-target impacts. Once you get to having the adults, though, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and we would pick them off plants and drop them in a container of soapy water to get rid of them that way. So if you've got a small space, you can do some manual control to pull them off when you see them. But definitely, if you're in the southeast corner of the state or on that I-29 corridor, keep an eye out for these guys, and you're going to want to try to manage them early in the season and make sure you're timing any treatments for the grubs effectively so that you're hitting the grubs when they're small before they have a chance to get big and do too much damage to the grass roots. I did throw our annual cicadas in here. Like I said earlier, they're not something I consider to be a garden pest. However, they are something that we see around every summer, and I do get a lot of questions about. So people just, maybe don't connect that this brown shell that you're going to be seeing, hanging off of, underside of trees or, walls or fence posts or whatever, that actually turns into this critter on the left, which is the adult cicada. They usually start emerging in July, get up in the trees and just scream for the rest of the summer. So they're pretty cool. I really enjoy the cicadas. And they're a good food source for those cicada killer wasps, as well as a bunch of our birds find them to be pretty tasty as well. So this is not an exhaustive sort of list of all the friends and foes that are out there. We do have a bunch of entomology publications through SDSU Extension. We've got a flip guide for natural enemies. And so that's something that if you would like a copy, you can stop by your closest regional center and they probably have some on hand, or you can always shoot me an email and we can drop one to you in the mail from here in Pier. But definitely check out our extension website. We've got some good stuff on there that you can sort of get your hands on and then use during the next growing season. So we're going to move into a slightly interactive-ish portion of the presentation. I did pull up the webinar chat so I can kind of hopefully see it. Just glance at it in case I get any responses that way. But when I was doing the Master Gardener course this past year, we were in Rapid City at the outdoor campus, which was great for catching insects. And one of the trainees brought back their net and had these two insects in it. And I was like, okay, I'm going to need you to hold these so that I can take a picture of them because they're a really great way to illustrate like why identification is important. So taking a look at these critters, uh, one of them is something that we would maybe consider to be a pest insect, and one of them is actually something that is going to be helpful in the garden. So we've got a critter on the left and we've got a critter on the right. For those of you watching live, feel free to type into the chat if you think left or right is our pest. And yeah, we've got a couple responses. And yep. So yeah, the right one is our pest. So that's actually a caterpillar. It's got a nice little well-formed head capsule. It's got those pro legs on the back of the abdomen, those little sort of like suction cup fake legs. And then that means on the left, that critter is actually something that's helping us. This is a syrphid fly larva. So you can see, like just at first glance, they're both kind of like soft-bodied, tubular critters, and you might think, well, maybe they're both the same. But kind of the more you get into looking closely at stuff in the garden, the more you'll start to notice some of these sort of finer differences. But that syrphid fly larva, it doesn't have any legs, either true or fake, because it is a fly larva. So it's actually technically a maggot, but it's a very like fancy maggot that eats aphids. It does not have a head capsule. The head is actually the pointy part on the left there. The back end of it is the chunky end. But yeah, if you see those, sometimes people kind of confuse them maybe with slugs because they don't have like a lot of body features, but they're actually going to turn into syrphid flies and they are predators. So I was just really stoked to get that picture this past year. And here's an example of a little bit of a case study. So maybe you're out scouting, you've got some soybeans, maybe you're growing some edamame, and you've got a bunch of aphids, but you're also seeing, this critter on the left. You're also seeing our friend here on the right, another syrphid fly larva. So what to do in this kind of situation, if you've got a crop that has an economic threshold or like a level where it makes sense economically to do a treatment. Maybe you count those aphids and figure out if you've reached your economic threshold. And if you have, maybe you do an application. But one thing that you'd notice here is that you also have natural enemies. So, if you're under your economic threshold, it might make sense to wait and kind of see if those predators are going to be able to like keep that aphid population below that threshold. They're never going to get to zero aphids, but you might be able to keep it under where you're seeing significant damage. But as you're out there scouting, not only paying attention to those pest critters, but also take a look. You might find some of our friends out there as well. Another case here, we've got zucchini, which is, my hand for scale. This zucchini has gotten pretty big. They're being very prolific. And you've got some of these brown insects present, as well as egg masses. So this means that you've got sort of a reproducing population of squash bugs. Management here, you might be thinking, okay, I'm, late enough in the growing season that I'm sick of zucchini and like, I don't care, the plant can just die, I'm fine with it. But maybe if you're still early in the season, you're like, okay, I've got egg masses. Let me see what I can do to get rid of those egg masses so that I can kind of like cut off, the next generation or reduce that next generation population. And a lot of insects are going to be easier to manage when they're nymphs. Once they get to be adults, that's sort of they're at their largest body size. They've got a thicker exoskeleton, and they can just be, harder to kill with chemicals that way. So when you're thinking about, solving your pest or your foe problems in the garden, it's important to decide how much damage you can tolerate. It's important to identify the problem, and I'll give you some resources for identification in a couple slides here. Um, as you're thinking about management options, starting with the least toxic one and then moving up if needed. And if you end up using pesticides, make sure that you're reading and following all of the label directions and wearing the proper protective clothing and following all the safety protocols. That counts for both chemical and non-chemical treatments, as well as both, organic and non-organic pesticides. Organic pesticides still require PPE. Just because something is organic doesn't make it, a zero risk product for you, the applicator. And I did want to throw in a couple insects that we have not confirmed in South Dakota, but they're headed our way. And we want to just sort of increase public awareness about them, so that we can maybe get them, marked off the map in South Dakota. One of them that I'm honestly surprised we have not confirmed in the state is the brown marmorated stink bug. It's everywhere around us, but we do have native stink bug species that can look very similar. So I think that might be part of why we haven't been able to confirm it in the state. It has, white bands on the antenna and kind of that sort of alternating light-dark pattern around the abdomen. These can be a really big vegetable pest. So when they showed up in Pennsylvania in the early 2010s, they were feeding on produce like just as it was getting ready to be ripe for harvest. So like tomatoes, sweet corn, apples, and they were causing a lot of economic damage that way because they have piercing sucking mouth parts. So they would say like stab the sweet corn through the husk and like, suck some kernels dry. So you almost like couldn't even see the damage. And then, you go to market that and, those are ears that people maybe pull back some of the husk and they're like, yeah, I'm not taking that. For apples, it was a big problem because that piercing was then an entry point for, bacteria, fungus for rot. And so then those apples would not be able to be used for, sauce, cider, whatever. So, they do need trees to survive. They do enjoy overwintering in like shelter belts and like tree rows. And South Dakota is a much sort of like harsher place than say Pennsylvania. And they overwinter as adults and they'll sometimes like congregate inside like homes or structures. So somehow in the like 12 years almost that I've been out here, I have not, gotten a brown marmorated stink bug to confirm in the state. But I do want people to keep an eye out for them because I have a feeling that they're somewhere, but they just maybe haven't reached like a real giant pest status yet for us to notice them. And then the other one that we want people to be aware of is the spotted lanternfly. This one is moving west again from Pennsylvania. Sorry, guys. But the egg masses are just sort of like brown and spongy, and they'll lay them on almost anything. So they're definitely, their movement is being aided and abetted by humans sort of unwittingly, on RVs, on pallets, on, trailers, that kind of thing. So we're seeing them sort of move west along like interstates. And there've been some, pickups of them in Ohio, in Indiana, in Illinois. They're taking a little bit longer to like establish in some of those areas, but we are, keeping an eye out for the spotted lanternfly because they also have a piercing sucking mouth part, and can be a big problem if you're a grape grower. But yeah, they're very distinctive. They have a lot of spots. They've got these red underwings. I have a couple that I have pinned in my traveling insect collection. So if you catch up with me at an in-person event, you'll be able to see a physical sample, to get an even better idea. But that's another one that's not nearly as close to South Dakota as the brown marmorated stink bug is, but we do want folks to be aware of them. And then some garden foes that aren't a plant problem, but could be a problem for you, the gardener. Um, be aware, like be tick aware. We've got a lot of ticks in South Dakota. The American dog tick pictured here is probably our most prevalent species. However, we do have some other ticks like the black-legged tick and the Lone Star tick that can vector some really not great diseases to people. So as you're out there in the garden over this, next growing season, keep an eye out for ticks. If you're going out hiking places, if you have a dog that goes with you, definitely be tick safe. The Department of Health has a survey, so if you do find a tick, they can help you identify it, and they can also sort of help you with resources if you need to get it tested for a disease. So um, don't sleep on ticks. Black-legged ticks are moving into more areas of South Dakota, and those are the ones that vector Lyme disease. So I know I spent a lot of time talking about things that could be like helping or harming your plants, but I did want to throw out sort of the PSA for some things that can harm you as a gardener. And then how to get things identified. If you've got a critter out there and you capture it, if it's something you're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is a pest, I want to know what it is, and I'm okay with killing it, put it in a hard-sided container, freeze it, and then you can take a picture of it or mail it to me here in Pierre. We also have an Ask Extension widget that you can access through our website. You can upload pictures there and I can grab your question that way. We have the plant diagnostic clinic on campus, so especially if you're dealing with maybe a disease or like a virus, some of those other plant issues that can happen. Insects aren't the only thing. We do have the diagnostic clinic that can help with that as well. And then we have garden hotlines throughout the state. The one in Brookings runs all year, but then we have Aberdeen, Pierre, Rapid City, and Sioux Falls during the growing season. So there's a lot of ways to connect with us in Extension to get some of your plant questions answered. And if it's a bug, you can always reach out to me here at the Pierre Regional Center. Some additional resources that I like to use, obviously extension websites. Bugguide.net is a great amateur and professional entomology network. Um, if you've just got a cool bug, it's a great place to throw a photo up on the forum and usually get a pretty quick identification. If you're somebody who's into butterflies, there's the Butterflies of South Dakota book that's published through Game Fish and Parks. And then I really like the Discover Life keys, especially for caterpillars, because you can put in the characters that you can see, like does it have spines, like what color is it? And it'll help you sort of narrow down that way. So it's not like your old dichotomous key that you had to like be really confident in every like fork. And then for 2025, places that you can find me where you can get some extension resources. We'll have Garden Hour starting May 6th. So that's going to be Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. We always have a different sort of rotating cast of characters, and I'm on at least once a month on that one. And then putting in the plugs now for Insect Fest at McCrory Gardens. Obviously, big proponent of getting more people to be cool with insects. And then our specialty crop field day, also in Brookings, will be later that next week. So this will be the 5th anniversary of the specialty crop field day. So I wanted to make sure you folks with the specialty crop producers had that save the date early. And with that, I'll throw my contact information up here for a hot second while I take a look at see if we've got anything in the Q&A box. Okay, no questions in the Q&A box. Awesome. But yeah, if folks have questions, looks like we've got a little bit of time for those. I will go ahead and hop through my last 2 legally required slides, and then I will stop sharing. But yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A or the chat. But otherwise,
I didn't know you were, I'm kind of a buggy person myself. I love bugs, but I didn't know there were 20 different kinds of bumblebees.
yeah, there's a surprising number of species. All right. So insects, it is definitely possible to transport insects. And I feel like if any of that happened, it would be like the USDA APHIS, I think, that gets those reports and deals with that as sort of a regulatory agency. Um, so I don't know if it's ever happened here. I've I'm on the wrong branch of the government to be part of that like rapid response team. But USDA does like keep track of things like coming into the country, things that are moving around inside the country, to try to limit the spread of some of those different invasive organisms. But yeah, like if you're moving, and this is why quarantines are so important. Like remember back with like emerald ash borer, um, why we don't move firewood anymore. Um, why quarantines are so important because so many of these things can be sort of helped along by people. Let's see. Dealing with squash bugs, identification and treatment. So squash bugs are I won't say they're pretty distinct. Sort of the only thing that really gets confused with squash bugs are the leaf-footed bugs, which have sort of those leafy like flattenings on their hind legs. But if you've got pumpkins and whatever, and you've got something that looks like that picture that I had up there, that's a squash bug. Their nymphs are sort of a grayish color and sort of a more teardrop shape. They sort of get that more mottled brown when they're adults. The egg masses are coppery colored, so they're going to have a bunch of eggs laid at one time in sort of these nice little like patterns in between the veins on the underside of a leaf. Um, I spent a lot of time with squash bugs in grad school. So this is why I'm like, let me tell you everything I know about squash. There is no magic bullet for squash bugs. Like there is no secret awesome treatment that we've all been holding out on everybody. They are a very tricky pest. Like this is why I get questions about them every year and it can be so frustrating. Squash bugs overwinter as adults. So when it warms up enough and they start moving around in the landscape, they are going to colonize the first cucurbit that they find that they like. Blue Hubbard is very attractive to them. So you can maybe try doing like some trap flats to kind of like see if you can pick them up early and like trap some of them out that way. But they overwinter in, leaf litter, in compost piles. If you're planting into plastic or like weed cloth or anything, don't plant cucurbits there 2 years in a row because they'll overwinter underneath that plastic or underneath that weed fabric if you don't remove it. So then they're just like you put the new plants in there and the squash bugs are just right there waiting. Um, they don't like to fly a lot, so they will be sort of walking to their like next home. So if you can, sometimes you can get sort of past them with timing. Like if you are the last person to plant pumpkins, a lot of times, you could maybe have them, they've all gone to your neighbor's place. But you're never going to get to a zero squash bug issue. Like you're never going to get to zero squash bugs unless you're not growing their host plants. But a lot of it just comes down to sanitation, scouting, and then being ready to go. Like, because yeah, there are insecticides that are labeled for them, but the trick is to get the good coverage on the plant, because the eggs are going to be on the underside. They do a really good job of hiding underneath the black plastic or underneath the weed cloth when the plant's disturbed. So it can be very hard to like hit them with product. And then they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So it's not like they're like a caterpillar that's like chewing up the plant material and consuming, a lot of that dried insecticide product like as they're eating. They're just stabbing the leaf and they're getting past sort of a lot of that. So yeah, no, they're great at what they do, at being a pest and like like don't I think a lot of people, I don't know, feel like it's a personal failing that they can't get on top of squash bugs. But they're just like so good at being a pest. Like it takes a lot of effort and I think sometimes you got to look at like what's your yield on those plants and be like, okay, have I hit my goal on zucchini? Like, can I just can I just pull this all out and like zucchini is done? Because yeah, like you could you could put a ton of inputs in there, still not get on top of them, and it's your pumpkin is not going to be any like more expensive. So yeah. Yeah, squash bugs, they do like to hang out on the underside of the leaf. They'll hang out at the base of the plants and like run underneath that like the weed fabric. They are very good at hiding. The egg masses are really like the easiest thing to find because like those don't move. But you know, when you're scouting, it's like you want to be flipping over the leaves because they're going to be on the underside of the leaves in between those, you know, in masses in between the veins. But I feel like Iowa State maybe had some like recent like I feel like I watched like a webinar or something from Iowa State like in the past year about squash bugs. I know they've had some entomology like labs at that university that have been doing some more research on them, but there has not yet been like a magic. We don't yet have a magic bullet for squash bugs. Any tips on dealing with vine borers? That's another one I spent a lot of time with. There are pheromone traps available for squash vine borer. So if you're growing a lot of squash, um, you know, production, whatever, there you can put out a pheromone trap so that you get an idea of when the moths are flying. This is one that like the pupa are overwintering, and so we need a couple, you know, we need a couple 100-degree days before those pupa will finish developing and the adults will emerge in June. And then once they start flying, then they're going to be mating and laying eggs sort of for the rest of the summer. They can be a very spotty pest. I've been very lucky, like they haven't found my yard ever. Even when I was in grad school, like the research plot that I wanted them to find, like they never did. But my like cooperators in Kentucky, like couldn't grow a squash to save their life because they had so many vine borers. So they can be really like geographically sort of distributed. But I'd say, you know, if you're looking to get fancy, pheromone trap. Otherwise, it's keeping an eye sort of at the base of the squash plants. And again, these are another one that likes your big cucurbits, like your butternuts, your pumpkins, your zucchini, they need a wide stem. They won't go for like a cantaloupe, like that's too skinny. They won't go for cucumbers because the egg, once it hatches, it's only on the outside of the plant for a very short period of time. So you have a very small window to be effective with any sort of insecticide. Once that caterpillar is inside the stem, it's going to be feeding on the inside of the stem. So you might notice that you have a stem that's like wilted and is not recovering, you know, when the sun goes down. And those are the ones that you go to investigate. You can sometimes get fancy and do some like surgery, you know, slit open the stem at the base, find the caterpillar and squish it. Or you can just like, you know, if there's nothing good happening on the rest of that stem, just take that off, make sure you're destroying the caterpillar. Um, but you know, that's really only effective if you've got a small number of plants that you're trying to keep track of. If you've got a larger operation, I would say you'd want the pheromone trap so you can be monitoring for activity and then timing your insecticide sprays based off of that and making sure that you're hitting the base of the plants. Also for all of these, you can use row cover at planting to try to like keep things off, but that worked well in Pennsylvania where it wasn't as windy. South Dakota has wind. So like I'll say row cover, but like with the complete understanding that like it's hard to keep that in place in South Dakota. But we would be trying because we were looking at these pests in organic production, and we're like, how can we keep them off the plants until we get to flowering, just so that we can give the plant sort of more time to get big and be able to tank some of the damage from these insects. Because once you have those female flowers, I mean, really, once you have the male flowers too, those are going to be first, but like you don't want to be putting any sort of broad spectrum insecticide out there when you've got especially female flowers, because then you're going to be impacting your pollinators. So, yeah, squash pests are a real doozy, and there there is no secret solution to them. I wish I had found one during my dissertation because then I would probably have a different life. But yeah, they're frustrating for everybody. It's not just you. And definitely happy, you know, shoot me an email or whatever during the season. You know, happy to talk more about squash bugs, squash vine borers, striped cucumber beetles, like the whole array of cucurbit pests.
I don't see any more questions, so I would like to thank you for your time today, Dr. Beckman. Um, I've learned a lot and identified bugs. I love spiders too,
Spiders are great.
especially the jumping spiders. I call them
Hmm.
angry monkey spiders because they're so cute. If you get
I
up real
love
close, they look like little angry monkeys. So, um, thank you. This webinar is funded through a collaboration between the NRCS and the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association. We look forward to you tuning into others. We have another one in 1 week with this Seed Savers uh, greenhouse coordinator dealing with starting seeds. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks.
Clippy.